Okay, we're 2 minutes past 11, so I'll start. Thank you for coming to what might be the only or one of the only explicit talks about design in open source. I think some other talks have talked about design, but hopefully, well, this one should give you some wonderful insight into how designers contribute to open source software. So this is The Secret Lives of Open Source Designers. This talk is a short summary of a report that we produced a couple of years ago on after doing a diary study with designers contributing to open source software. At the bottom of the slides, it's quite small, but you can see the link to the repository. So if you do want to take a picture of any of the slides so that you get a link to the repository, you should have it there already, where all of the research, final report and everything is all there. Obligatory section where I talk about the organization that I work for that supported this work. Superbloom is a design and research nonprofit that is changing who technology serves as our mission. We do this by leveraging design to shift power within the tech ecosystem, inclusive of open source software ecosystem. You might have heard of us before. We were called Simply Secure, but we changed our branding using an open collaborative community process, actually a couple of years ago, which you can read about on our website if you're interested. So we changed our name to Superbloom Design now. We're an international team at Superbloom with expertise in user research, design, software development, and product management. We're supported by a diverse set of advisors and partners, and then we've been working in the internet freedom, human-centered design, and public interest technology sectors since we were founded as Simply Secure in 2015. Recently, just to give you a bit of an understanding of what we do, so some of the projects that we've been working on over the last few years are centered around questions about how do high-risk communities and individuals in remote, hard-to-reach, poorly connected regions safely give user feedback on the technology that they use. How can funders of open source software and otherwise best support sustainable critical digital infrastructure, and what does that actually mean to the people and the organizations that they're funding? We did lots of user research around how a funder can better understand the usability needs of the kinds of things that they're funding critical infrastructure-wise. And lots of work across the spectrum of working with projects, open source software projects, doing workshops at different conferences, being advocates for design in open source around open design and open source design, in order for design to become a normalized, regular presence in the open source software space and the tool creation, improvement, and growth of design and usability in open source software. This is me. Hi. I'm Eriol. I've been doing design professionally for about 15 years and about 6 or 7 years specifically in the open source software space as a designer of many different design titles across the spectrum of different professional titles. I've been at Superbloom Design for 4 years, and I'm also one of the core maintainers at Open Source Design. You can find open source design at opensourcedesign.net. We maintain a number of things. Mostly it's a community space for when designers want to begin to contribute to open source software, and they are beginning that journey on where can I contribute, how can I find supportive community. That's often where they end up. Open Source Design has run a FOSDEM dev room since we were created about 10 or 11 years ago, Open Source Design, and hopefully we will continue to run a FOSDEM dev room for open source design for many years. And we help open source software projects understand what they might need as far as design goes, and we help connect designers to those projects. We have a jobs board that we maintain for both contribution projects and also projects that might have a little bit of funding to put towards design. Anyone can submit a job on our jobs board from our website. In 2022, so to talk more about the diary studies in the report, in 2022, the Vermont Complex Systems Center at the University of Vermont awarded Superbloom an OCEAN grant, the Open Source Ecosystems and Network Research Award. To investigate and give designers who are currently contributing to open source software an opportunity to describe their experiences in a safe environment through anonymous, privacy-respecting means. This is something that's very foundational to Superbloom's work. We work a lot on privacy and security open source tools, and we want to make sure that everyone that does user research with us has their levels of privacy and security respected as best they can be and as requested. What we found early on talking to designers that wanted to talk about their experiences in open source is they often found that some of the difficult things about contributing to open source, they were less ready to talk about those openly and be identified. So this gave them an opportunity to talk about the things that they found, or the criticisms that they maybe had of open source software and how they think it could be better without impacting them individually. So we wanted to keep them all anonymous, and we did. So this short research project, it ran for, the diary studies were contributed to by the designers for 10 weeks across a period of time that suited them. So some designers contributed for 10 weeks consecutively, some designers took breaks. So in total, it was 16 weeks of collecting data from designers on their contributions. And we wanted to investigate some key questions related to design in open source and fill in some of the larger systemic gaps of information from the non-code contribution experiences in open source. So design, typically, both GUI and user research design currently in open source software is sometimes done by developers, by coders, the people that create and maintain their open source software. And sometimes those coders, developers, software engineers do have some explicit or innate design skills, like they have a curiosity to ask usability questions or user-related questions, or they know they've done some thinking and reading around the subject. So sometimes the design aspect is coming from software engineers and coders that are creating open source software. And very rarely is open source software having designers at the start of a project involved. It's much more common that designers begin to join in open source software after it's been created and maintained for a while. So it's difficult to understand where and define boundaries between the different roles and what are optimal conditions for success if we want to kind of think about what is successful design in open source. But one of the things that this study wanted to try and understand is how are the designers themselves, as they contribute to open source, defining success. And so a lot of the critical findings towards the end of the report are about how designers are defining success. My contribution was successful because of these conditions or these conversations, interactions, or contributions that I made. So the research questions for this diary study are, what are the experiences that designers contributing to open source software are commonly having? What are the conditions that can set designers up for success in the open source software project, specifically regarding the contributions of design stuff, like contributions of either, however the designers are defining their design contributions? And how can we learn from the success from these designers in the study so that we can advise projects that if they do some of these things, they could have the same success that these designers in the study described? And what conditions create a sense of inclusion, both at the project and community scales for designers in open source software? So how can we better make open source software a place where designers already know that they are welcome, they are wanted, their skills are valued, and they are contributing in a successful or fruitful way, a way that makes them feel good? We also wanted to try and understand how human-centered design was understood within open source software communities, or just design was understood within open source software from the designer's perspective. So how are designers communicating what they do and the benefits of what they do as design usability work in open source software, and how is it understood better through the contributions of designers to open source software? How do designers in open source software projects maintainers, communities describe the successful design contributions, the actual contribution aspect, not just the interactions of the contributions, and how do designers describe a successful relationship with open source software projects and developers and maintainers and communities. There seems to be a lot of focus on the word success. It was really difficult to try and hinge. We essentially just wanted to find out how are designers experiencing open source software, and we hinged it around this term of success. How can we understand what are both the positives, negatives, and everything in between with design contributions to open source software? And one of the ways that we could begin to measure that is by thinking about, okay, how do you describe success as a designer? Or the opposite of success. So for a diary study, if you're unfamiliar, we started off the diary study with some interviews with designers at first, just to understand what they're doing better. So these were semi-structured, contextual interviews lasting around 45 minutes, and we asked lots of background questions to the designers, like how did you start in open source software? How did you start in design? Some of the designers started off as software engineers or developers and transitioned into design as their main contributions to open source software. Some came from an educational background. And what open source software do you contribute to and participate in? How do you decide on a project and what they'd like to work on or contribute to? And how do they find that information, if they indeed are looking for it? And do they contribute to open source software as part of a paid role, a volunteer contribution, and in what ratio? And how does paid or volunteer open source software work feel to you? So this is a critical kind of question for a designer. I won't go into this in too much depth right now. But design has a historical undervaluing of its craft, or of it generally, is often the kind of historical joke is that because it's creative and artistic in some ways, you could describe that it's fun, and therefore you should be grateful to be contributing your fun, artistic stuff to. It's a common thing that designers kind of get, oh, well, you do the fun part of it, but it's still work. Design is a job. It's still an effort. But there is a huge amount of historical experiences from most designers in rarely ever being paid for their professional design work, especially early on in their career. It's quite a common thing for designers to hear, do it for the credibility, do it for the kudos, right? We'll shout you out on our Twitter or whatever. So yeah, so understanding how open source software contributions felt different between being paid and volunteering was something that I was really interested in for this study. A little bit about the designers that we spoke to. We had 5 different participants. This is a bit of information about them. So whether they were in part-time or full-time work, what their kind of employment status was, whether they were kind of staff somewhere, whether they were contracted, whether they were a student or described themselves as a student, and how many roughly at the time of the diary study projects did they contribute to actively. One of the things I like to make sure that I talk about, we had a small grant for this work from Ocean, and pretty much all of that grant went to pay the designers for the diary study. So the designers got stipends of $1,000 in 2 different installments to participate in this. It kind of follows on from that comment that I was saying about designers rarely get paid for their insight work generally. So we wanted to make sure we set a really healthy precedent to say we really value your insights and contributions and time spent on this diary study, so we paid them. And then Superbloom supported with their own core funding, the writing of the report and the organizing and admin of it. But you can see here that there's a sort of a mix of people from different statuses, and also the participants were from very different, reasonably different global locations. So we had people from the USA, Canada, Nigeria, Brazil, and Germany. Sadly, in this study, we didn't have a lot of representation from Central, East in East Asia and the North African region. Ideally, if we run this again, we'd like to find new locations to get insight from designers there. So every week the designers would get a survey, or they had a few different options on how they could respond to or do their diary study. They could either send us audio files, video files, they could write about their experiences freeform, or they could fill out a question and answer survey, however they best wanted to participate. But some of the weekly question focuses were about what were the communication processes that they engaged in as part of their contributions to open source software. So how did they communicate with the projects? Was it through issues, comments? Was it through email, direct communication in some way, using chat systems? And how did they communicate about their design work, typically? Critical to this kind of question is that most of the platforms where the open source code is hosted don't tend to be particularly friendly for design stuff, as in, you know, if you're defining design stuff as your JPEGs, your PDFs, your SVGs, your design files, designers can produce a lot of writing work, which is more friendly for common repository areas, like they can still write markdown files for research. But it is a lot harder to do collaborative research documents on markdown files. Like you can't have comment, question and answers. So actually a lot of the designers doing user research work were preferencing collaborative documentation systems, and that usually gets contributed via like a link to a cloud document. So yeah, how was the communication happening across the projects and the designers? How designers define the success of their contributions and how they made their contributions, like how they sent them over, how they defined them as finished, or did they ever define them as finished? What tools were designers using when they were contributing to open source software, and how were they viewed by the open source software? So a lot of designers are still coming on board with the open source software alternative tools for designers, such as, you know, your Inkscapes and your GIMPs and your Penpot tools, as well as like some document creation tools. And we wanted to understand how that was viewed by the designers and the open source software that they were contributing to. And then what design artifacts, that's kind of just a fancy way in design of saying what design stuff was being contributed and shared across the 10 to 16 weeks of the diary study. So was it written documents? Was it collaborative design files? Was it conversations with users and user testing materials? Like, what were the things that the designers were contributing? Sadly, we couldn't put those, we saw the examples of the design stuff that they were creating, but we couldn't put those in the report because it would identify the designers very clearly. Like, there's only a certain amount of designers contributing to quite popular, well-known projects, so you can identify them quite easily by knowing the projects that they're involved in. That's why in the report you won't see a specific like name of like an open source project. You'll see them kind of abstracted as an operating system open source software, or a developer tool, or a community, or a conference. But yeah, it's really interesting, the projects that were being contributed to. But to get into some of the results from the report, so one of the really interesting parts of the report that I've picked out for this talk is the designer and developer involvement and collaboration. It was a recurring theme within the weekly surveys that the designers were responding to. So at some point, all of the designers used GitHub or GitLab or some kind of place where the source code or the source of the open source software was existing. And these were traditionally seen as tools for developers for the communication and collaboration. But the participants mentioned at least once through the 10 weeks, if not more, how much they struggled with the tools. Everything from, I don't know how to use this tool, and I don't know how to use this tool optimally to communicate, because I've never come here before, I don't come here regularly to do my day-to-day work, right through to things such as the maintainers or developers have a higher status in these spaces, i.e. they have higher permissions level, access to certain tools and things, and the designers were not kind of communicated with to say, like, what level of access actually helps you do your design contributions. They were just kind of, it was decided that they didn't need a certain level of access given what they were doing. So this was kind of a really interesting part of the collaboration. There was a decision being made on behalf of the designers by the maintainers of the projects, with the impression of what they thought the designers would be doing rather than having the communication and collaboration. So some comments from the designers. I'm not sure the best way to use GitLab for design tickets. GitLab has done some really interesting stuff with design contributions since, I think, and before this. But designers are still not really sure across the ecosystem of tools that primarily developers use, how best to use them for design contributions. I see somebody with a GitLab t-shirt as well. I feel really bad saying this next one. I hate GitLab. It's confusing and the team did not put me as a developer yet. So this is about the access to certain sections of a repository, certain private parts of a repository, say, or maybe parts where if you did delete a file by accident, things are going to happen that you don't want to happen. So designers found that they were met with the kind of typical read the manual approach to learning the tool, either the open source software itself that they were contributing to, or the tools in which like the contributions were happening. And this really didn't address the nuances of how designers work and how designers want to contribute to open source software and collaborate with them. And they really often had to figure out what they needed access to and why and how to even ask. Like, who do I even ask? How do I even ask that I might need access to something here? Or I might need to ask somebody to show me a part of the open source software because I'm not actually going to be... designers are sometimes, but they're rarely... the kinds of users that developers are also, the developer contributors are. So they can be users of the open source software, but there are also enough designers that want to contribute design to the open source software without necessarily like installing it, running it, and they might not even have the conditions in order to run it. So here there's some need for extra documentation, or at the very least pathways to ask for what they need. And they're definitely not going to be, most commonly they're not going to be installing or beginning their journey with the open source software they want to contribute to in the same way that a kind of code contributor would be, in that they will follow like the installation guide in that same way. It's a slightly different process for most designers. So this was interesting though, because this depending on how you say this could come off as like kind of mean, like, but the developers were really involved in the design. They love giving feedback on the design side of things. So getting responses from the developers about design proposals wasn't too difficult. In fact, like developers were like very ready to offer like what they thought about design, if indeed they had the interest. But there's sort of a bias here that was coming up with the responses, in the sense that it was generally more accessible for the developers and coders to participate in the design process, and there was a lot of explicit effort being made on behalf of the designers to include the developers in that iterative communication collaboration process. Then necessarily things on the coding side was not kind of, very few developers or coders were reaching out to the designers and saying, hey, do you have thoughts on how we build this API endpoint? Because there's an assumption that designers wouldn't have a contribution there, but they often can and do have thoughts and contributions about the usability of things like that. But when they were welcomed, designers were happy to be welcomed, and the designers were very happy that the developers were participating in the collaboration process on design feedback, and they were happy and described this as successful because they really wanted to generally improve the open source software for as many users as possible. That's kind of a general theme across a lot of the findings for design contributions to open source here. But yeah, the designers were frustrated that they didn't necessarily get the same opportunities to participate in code-related matters. And the learning curve kind of did interrupt that kind of aspect there, because often the designers were asked to go and, well, learn about this before you can come and give comments. You know, there wasn't sort of like a, how can I actually help you give comments or feedback? But all of the designers mentioned getting feedback from the developers as a crucial step in their process, and this will become, I will reference this again later, and if I don't, please remind me, because this is connected. Some more quotes from the designers that are more positive here is, I made user flow diagrams to make my designs more comprehensible, which was really good, and a developer found my organized Figma files very useful. So these are like some of the positive comments that designers were giving as they were participating. An aspect of the report that we've got as well is openness practices. So the motivations for being open seem to follow some general themes for designers. They want to share their assets and resources so that it's easier for collaboration with stakeholders, whether that's the coders, developers, or anyone else involved in the project. But there was another motivation for sharing assets, and it was to have more involvement from the community as a whole, so users or other designers. One participant shared a comment, which is, I shared a doc with the team at the open source community organization for other designers to make input. So there was a real desire to attract more designers or other designers with being more open and practicing more openness practices. And to just kind of wind back on openness practices, this isn't common for designers like outside of the open source space. We're not necessarily really taught what being open and transparent really is in our education processes, be they formal education or informal education. Openness isn't necessarily something that's really touched on until you kind of get into the free and open internet space. Again, some of these comments seem quite like general, but they are huge measures of success for designers. So a designer heard back from someone they shared their open design resources with, and that they heard that it was helpful and that they would be using the contributions, and this was huge for the designer. Even these kind of small aspects of just the contributions being used is huge for the designers. But being open as a designer and participating in open source as a designer generally comes with a lot more effort. In the sense that the ways of documenting, sharing, and collaborating and pushing your design contributions are more centralized or more proprietary than, so often the software that we use is very closed, or it's behind, sign-up walls, essentially. And it's just not necessarily a practice, again, that designers are initially really used to documenting their processes more openly and clearly. In sort of, I liken it to learning how to comment in your code is for designers, is if you show them that process and kind of say, well, what's the version of this? But for your design file, they'll start to think about, okay, how can we replicate what commenting could look like in our, to explain what our design file or designs are trying to do. But there's also some aspects here about like designers just learning how to interact with things like PRs and issues and labels, and the ecosystem of everything there is incredibly new. I'm going to talk about some of the measurements of success. I'm only going to focus on two of them because I don't have a lot of time left. I'm going to focus on success via feedback and then another one. So success via feedback. So designers saw their work or contributions to open source software as successful when the feedback they received was relevant and useful. And this is a very specific use of two words here, relevant and useful. So the designers often got a lot of different feedback, but whether it was relevant and whether it was useful was that critical element of whether they measured it as a successful interaction contribution. But designers tended to assume that they got it right or were successful enough if there was no questions or feedback on their design work. So if an issue with a design or a PR with some kind of design contribution was uncommented on. They were like, I guess that's fine, and I'll just leave it there and then move on to another contribution. But this was less so if the designer did not seem particularly confident about that proposed design. So if there was less confidence in whether this was meeting the needs of that contribution that they were making, they sort of got more nervous about lack of feedback and just being okay with their own confidence in what they were contributing. And then participants viewed slow feedback negatively, and lack of communication was seen as a progress blocker. So this is really interesting within open source software, because once you've been around for a while, you realize that all different open source software projects have their own pace and timing. Some go faster than others, some go as slow as one release every few years. I mean, it sort of depends on the project. But designers don't really know this until they encounter it for the first time. So it's something that can really help if you're onboarding people into contributions. It's like, hey, this is how frequently we update, or this is how frequently we communicate, or this is how communication and feedback processes happen. And normalizing some of the stuff that people in open source for a long time take for granted as normal, just making it clear that those things are normal. I had a designer that I mentored for a while that came to me and said, is it normal for an issue to have 50 comments about a sort of menu, file menu, edit, change? And I was like, yeah, it's normal, that's perfectly normal. But they were like, it must mean my design is bad if there's 50 comments of feedback. And they just didn't know how to manage that cultural aspect of open source feedback processes. So relevant and useful means, is it relevant to the problem that the design is trying to solve? Or are you kind of doing a bike shedding process where you're talking about something that's sort of connected to an aspect of the open source, which can get tricky because sometimes the ecosystem of open source do have multiple connections when you change something somewhere, which does need to be clearly explained to designers that are working in that space for contributions. And was it useful? So this is a comment about what you've done, and here's how I think we can improve this for these reasons for this user, and this is what I would suggest. So not just comments which is like, I like this or I don't like this, to be kind of glib about it, but things that directly relate to what is trying to be solved. So some comments: when I get feedback on what's wrong in my design and I get the next steps that are actionable, success. And there was a delay in feedback from my prior conversations with the maintainer, and I was unable to kick off immediately. Now this seems like quite quick and quite insistent from the designer, but there's a sort of, I think there's something that can be done here where if you ask what the designer's expectations of how quickly feedback needs to be for them, then that can help solve this. Because some designers assume that if they don't get feedback within a month or even a week, they will bounce to another project, to another more active project, or how they perceive to be an active project. To go a little bit faster, so success via knowing what the priority is for the open source software. So this might be a kind of controversial topic depending on who you talk to. But measuring progress on priorities was really difficult for one of the designers in the study. They spoke consistently of the need for a product or a project manager to guide them through the highest priority tasks. Now, somebody that's kind of used to some of the conventions of open source or software development might look at S1s or, bug level, higher bug levels, and say, okay, that's the highest priority. But again, that's not necessarily a basis of understanding for most designers. So they do need some more guidance about, okay, how do you define high priority? Or how can you make it more clear what the high priorities are for people that aren't used to that kind of language of severity of issue or bug? But designers did employ a lot of tactics in order to better understand the priorities in absence of any kind of roadmap or plan, or when the open source plan exists in a single mind or a collective of maintainers' brains of oh, these are going to be the most important things for us to work on. But they essentially asked for a lot of communication, a lot of meetings. One designer even picked up the Eriol phone which might be quite strange in open source, an actual phone call, using not a video call, an actual phone call to a phone number to kind of get some feedback from the main maintainer. But this kind of says that really, if there's any kind of sense of what your priorities or objectives are that are in a accessible, hey, this isn't like our concrete roadmap, but our priorities are these users and these kinds of things, then that's going to help a designer. So if you've got something that looks like that, it doesn't have to be perfect, then a designer is going to get a little bit further with what they're looking for around priority tasks. Because they don't want to just do a we don't want to just come in and go, oh, we're going to redesign your UI. We really do want to know, what do you need to do for your users? What are the highest priority things? So not much of a hack, but I've started to get important stakeholders to sketch out their ideas more so that I know what they're thinking. So a lot of designers are asking maintainers and coders to start sketching in order to understand what's in their brains, even if it's just like a system, like the architecture system of how things talk to each other. That helps the designers understand it a bit more, or how users are using things. So in the report, other things that you can read about are the long cycles of communication in open source software processes, and who makes decisions and how are they made. Spoiler alert, designers are very rarely involved in the critical decision-making processes, which could be better. Who are the users of open source software? Dealing with overwhelming amounts of design work. There's a lot of design work that needs to be done on open source software. Being paid for open source software contributions, and designers in open source software in their busy lives. Designers have a lot of stuff going on in their personal lives, and many of them were balancing full-time work with contribution, families, lots of other things. I love this question, but I think we should be asking this question more regularly of everyone involved in open source software. But I was particularly interested in why a designer might leave an open source software project. Lots of different challenges for designers in open source software projects around communication, project management, delegation, but predominantly around the value of their work compared to the time invested by them. So how are you indicating that you value the design contributions and that you are grateful for them in some way? And this didn't balance out for most designers. They expressed a lot of disappointment when all of their time was spent on annotating and documenting specific details of a design artifact. This does this. And justifying why design should be done in the open source software. So a lot of time was spent like saying, we need to fix this because this is why I think this is important as a designer, as opposed to like creating the design contribution. And designers want 7 things to be, from the report, they want 7 things to be present before they leave a project, before they even, a lot of designers were very similar to coders and maintainers in that they could never conceive of leaving a project. Like they found this, I was like, what do you want there to be when you leave? And they're like, I'll never leave my project, no matter what. I was like, But just to pick out a couple, they want the design to be left in a way that other people can pick up and understand. So they do really want the time to document to be able to hand it over. And they want to plan the structure for the open source software to not just recognize design contributions, but document them as well too. So making sure that the decisions around how they do design is documented, like the kind of meta level of how design is done. But yeah, the designers desire to never fully leave a project, and they would ideally stay as long as they possibly can. So a couple of the recommendations, the report has a couple of recommendations at the end based off of all the things we learned. So as an open source software project interested in receiving design contributions, take note of the ways in which designers decide whether or not to offer design to an open source software project. Some of these indicators for designers include, is the project clear with the problems that they want solved by a designer in any way? It doesn't have to be like exactly a design brief, but is this open source software a one-person project, and is it still active? It doesn't matter if it's a one-person project and very active, or many people and only a little bit active, but they're looking for these indicators somewhere on the repository. And they're also looking for them in probably not places that coders would look for. Like they don't necessarily look in the commits or the releases as readily as other people. Designers measure success in lots of different ways, but the common ways are through healthy feedback cycles, regular, as agreed, and usable suggestions for the designs, and having the designs implemented at some point. The designers didn't have an expectation that they would be implemented immediately. They didn't have an expectation that they would be never rolled back for any reason, but they did want things to be implemented in some way. And understanding the priorities and who decides them, growing the design community sustainably, and being acknowledged positively for their contributions, which are hopefully not too surprising. And my last comment on this work is going to be, we did this a couple of years ago now. It'd be great to do it again. The things that I would want to do different or more in another version of this kind of report is inviting the open source software projects and community members to also comment on how design is being done. So this was just from the designers' perspectives. Better understanding the ways in which different roles view design and designers alongside the purpose of the open source from involving more of those people in open source would be really great, and including different kinds of open source projects. So academic research focus, developer tools, just making sure there's a broader spectrum of different kinds of open source represented. And with that, I will finish. I'm a little bit over. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.